the heart of a rapidly changing world, France is a country in flux. Changes in public service, industry and agriculture are altering the social makeup of the country, causing many people to ask, what do France and Frenchness mean in the 21st century? In Crossroads France, we've picked out 5 areas of French life where the country is facing new choices about the road ahead. I'm Barney Spender. Bienvenue. In this 4th episode, we head to the Alps and its snow-spun capital, Grenoble, where one university has found itself in the eye of a storm. Sciences Po is, by and large, a pretty tranquil establishment, but that calm was shattered by a debate over how to talk about Islam. It began in late 2020, but since then, the controversy has grown. Sciences Po Grenoble unwittingly became a mirror, reflecting the tensions within the academic world and in French society. The subject is so sensitive that a single word was enough to trigger an almost national debate. That word? Islamophobia. In France, religion has no place in public life. Laïcité, or secularism, has figured in French law since 1905 and was written into the Constitution in 1946. So, for example, you'll never see a president taking an oath on the Bible or the Quran, nor will you see a crucifix hanging in a public school. But today's debate about secularism is mostly centred around France's second religion, Islam. For some, Islam is simply not compatible with a secular republic. Others see the pursuit of French secularism as a means to exclude Muslims from public life. Crossroads France, Episode 4, Islam, the high-risk debate. January 2022, and everyone at Sciences Po Grenoble, students, teachers and management, seems to be exhausted by the months of controversy.
It's shown up the tensions that existed at Sciences Po for a while, and obviously the media coverage made it much more difficult to live with.
Let's backtrack to March the 4th, 2021, when the names of Professor Klaus Kinzler and another staff member, Vincent Tournier, were plastered on the walls of the university, each accused of Islamophobia and fascism. The images circulated briefly on the internet, sending shockwaves around many French households concerned about the safety of the two men.
The
two men were placed under police protection so as to avoid a repeat of the Samuel Paty tragedy.
That's centre-right Les Républicains MP Virginie Duby-Muller, citing the case of Samuel Paty, a history teacher who in October 2020 was murdered by an extremist outside his school in the Paris suburbs, decapitated. During a lesson on freedom of expression, Paty had shown his students caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. France recognises the right to blasphemy, criticism of religions. But the Islamist attack on the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo in 2015, in which 12 people died, showed all too clearly the criticism of Islam can cost lives. So on March the 4th, 2021, when he was publicly accused on social networks of being Islamophobic, Vincent Tournier feared for himself and his family.
I didn't want to get involved in all that. I didn't want my face to be exposed in the media. I was afraid for my family, obviously. It's the first time I had to tell my children, if they ask you if you're my own children, you say no.
Time to rewind a little bit further to the start of all of this in the autumn of 2020. Students and teachers are preparing a day of debate entitled Racism, Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Kinzler, a professor in the German department, criticises the use of the term Islamophobia. For him, it's used by Islamists and doesn't refer to racism against Muslims. That prompts a very lively email disagreement with one of his colleagues, who says the term Islamophobia is legitimately used in research. During the course of these exchanges, Klaus Kinzler criticises Islam. If the debate was limited to the two academics, that might well have been the end of it. But the students were copied in, and thus it went public. Returning from the Christmas holidays, the debate escalated. On the internet, a students' union accused Kinsler, without directly naming him, of being Islamophobic. It also called for testimonies on Facebook against Vincent Tournier, who lectures on Islam. The term Islamophobia is not only divisive at Sciences Po Grenoble. A large part of the political class refuses to use it. In 2019, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leading left-wing candidate for this year's presidential election, justified his participation in the controversial march against Islamophobia as a defense of true French Muslims.
Our Muslim compatriots are today singled out, insulted, physically threatened. It is our duty to come to the rescue and give our protection as we did in the past for the Jews. And we will do it again and as many times as it takes whenever someone in this country is insulted because of his religion, his skin color, or his practices.
Critics like Kinsler believe the term Islamophobia has been hijacked and is being used as a catch-all for anyone who criticizes Islam.
It
is absolutely far from me to deny that there is a form of racism in France against Muslims, but I don't think the term Islamophobia is the best one to describe this.
In the dictionary, there are two definitions for Islamophobia: hostility towards Islam and/or hostility towards Muslims.
Islamophobia is normally a fear of Islam. I admit that I am sometimes afraid of Islam. It's not Islam as a religion, it's Islam as it has presented itself for about 40 years in its fundamentalist form. In France, there have been several hundred victims of Islamist terrorism over the past 20 years or so. Think of the role of women, for example. Think of the segregation within a community, the Muslim population growing in the ghettos, in the neighborhoods, suburbs, etc., which separates itself from society and adopts values that are very far from the values of the French Republic. It can be scary. It has nothing to do with racism against Muslims.
The Declaration of Rights, adopted during the French Revolution in 1789, enshrined the notion of freedom of expression. Kinsler believes he's using that to criticize fundamentalist Islam.
I have no problem, and I would never have any problem with Muslims. So treating me like that, calling me a fascist, I'm actually a liberal, and an Islamophobe, is not only that it puts me in physical danger objectively, it's quite simply a means of propaganda to silence me.
Kinsler's colleague, who defended the term Islamophobia in the email exchange, declined our request to discuss the debate. To understand her arguments, we turned to Vincent Gesser, a researcher and former student at Sciences Po Grenoble. In 2003, he published a book entitled The New Islamophobia. According to Gesser, some critics have said that the word Islamophobia was invented by extremist groups to justify their fundamentalism, setting up an excuse to attack secularism. He says the term needs to be used with caution, but agrees that Islamophobia does exist in France.
We tend to associate all visible forms of Muslim practices with Islamism. Some people would say that they are anti-Islamist to justify a rejection of all visible signs, such as the veil or the beard.
Beyond the actual debate, everyone at Sciences Po Grenoble was shocked by the poster campaign that might easily have put Kinsler and Tournier and their families at risk. Tensions surfaced again in the fall when Kinsler accused the university in an interview of being an institute of, and I quote, political re-education, an allusion to communist repression. Sciences Po wasn't overly impressed and duly suspended Kinsler for 4 months for failing to respect his position as a public servant. Coming as it did in the midst of the presidential campaign, that decision caused plenty of political kickback. Right-wing and far-right candidates have denounced it as an attack on freedom of expression, with the university showing an ideological drift. Laurent Wauquiez, the Les Républicains centre-right president of the region, said he'll suspend funding for Sciences Po Grenoble. For Gilles Bastin, professor of sociology at the university, there's undoubtedly a political hand at play.
This instrumentalization has, in part, been pushed through by political agendas, which are undoubtedly linked to the current electoral campaign. Also, at the Ministry of Education, there's a desire to find cases of Islamo-leftism or wokeism in French universities. The ministry is going against the greater part of the education community to make examples.
A number of politicians from the government and from the right and far right have been accusing certain academics of defending religious minorities to the point of falling into a form of collusion with radical Islam. They call it Islamo-leftism. Klaus Kinzler published a book with the provocative title Islamo-leftism Did Not Kill Me. Is his colleague Vincent Tournier.
Part of the left, the radical left, has given itself the mission of fighting for a religion, or defending a religion, which is something quite new. Concerns about French secularism are stronger than before. Maybe there's a feeling that the elites are letting go on the question of secularism. I think that's maybe it. And it's being played out through the Sciences Po affair.
Every democratic system in the Western world has its own version of secularism, including the US and the UK.
Philippe Portier is Director of Studies at the Practical School for Advanced Studies and a specialist in religions.
What characterizes French society from this point of view is two things. First, legally, the French state wants religion to keep a low profile, more so than in other countries. The second element isn't a legal one, but it comes more from the public. In a part of French society, there's a feeling of defiance and sometimes hostility towards religion that one doesn't find in the same way in other Western societies.
In France, secularism was set in stone in 1905 with the law separating church and state. But Portier sees a recent hardening of his second element.
In the past, secularism was aimed at regulating religions by taking into account their constitutional freedom. That's been transformed more and more into an instrument of control over religions.
But this evolution of secularism isn't always accepted.
This brings us back to the episode in Grenoble. There are different ways of understanding secularism. Some think we must maintain liberal secularism and even open it up to more multicultural perspectives, taking into account ethnic, religious and regional differences much more than before.
In Grenoble, a new controversy over Islam erupted in the fall of 2021. The association that manages the Sciences Po cafeteria found a cheaper supplier. When they saw these products were halal, they advertised the fact on social media. Reasonable enough? Wrong. The principle of secularism in France prohibits the sale of religious food in a public establishment. Needless to say, it affected the students. Here's 20-year-old Inès, a Muslim.
I knew it wasn't done at all with the aim of including it in all dishes for everyone. I knew very well they were just being transparent, saying that's what we sell. I knew it wasn't for me as a Muslim, but it did make me feel way more included.
Inès was deeply affected by the ensuing media outcry.
I started crying. I don't know why. It was the last straw, I think, a culmination of everything I had heard before. It brought me down to earth. Sometimes I don't feel wanted here, just when I think I have found my place. I was born here. My father was also born here. But sometimes you feel like you're not wanted. I'm not talking about the university. I've never had any problems here. But when we hear, I don't know, Zemmour speak, we hear him more and more, all the time. A bit too much, I think.
Un peu trop, je trouve.
Many presidential candidates, especially on the right and the far right, mention Islam in their campaign. But it's Eric Zemmour who talks about it the most, as we heard in episode 3, making the supposed Islamization of France the DNA of his campaign.
Bonjour.
C'est moi, Léa.
Enchanté.
De même.
Meet Leia, another 20-year-old student at Sciences Po Grenoble.
Ma mère est de Bosnie-Herzégovine.
My mother's from Bosnia-Herzegovina. She is Bosniak. That's a Muslim minority in the Balkans. And my father's French. They met during the war in Bosnia and then came to France. It was my mother who raised me as a practicing Muslim.
How would you describe your identity?
A woman to start, Muslim, also white and of middle social class. I wouldn't feel obliged to specify white if there wasn't the Muslim behind it, because it's something that's also very close to my heart. To make people understand there's diversity in Islam, white Muslim and Bosnian, also because I'm very attached to it.
And is it difficult to be a Muslim in France?
Oui, c'est sûr que ça l'est.
Yes, of course it is. Well, I'm a bit protected from all that. No one's going to be sucked in. I can keep my faith to myself if I feel I am surrounded by people who may want to throw insults around or do something dangerous. Yes, it's hard. We get strange looks. They always feel the need to justify themselves. When I was in high school, there were people in the canteen who sometimes came to put pork on my plate. It was meant to be a joke for them, but it never really made me laugh. And people always assume that I converted. I've been asked if it was because I was dating an extremist. Well, I don't know. There is a diversity within Islam itself, and there are certainly people who are not correct. But there is a happy medium.
Since the 1960s and 70s, many immigrants, often Muslims, have been coming to France from her former colonies. They come to work, and then they stay. Philippe Portier believes the influx of Muslims may have created a feeling of rejection in society.
Il y a là, d'une certaine manière, mais c'est un peu le cas dans tous les pays d'Europe.
It's true in a way, just as it is across every country in Europe. It's a factor in producing a certain cultural insecurity, taking up a concept which has sometimes been used by sociologists who lead French society into not accepting these differences that are growing within it. The attacks have systematically reinforced this position of rejecting the Muslim religion since the 1990s.
A recent survey in France showed that 61% of people questioned think that Islam represents a threat to the Republic.
Cette population demande à l'État d'être...
This section of the population is asking the government to be firmer in the regulation of religions, but above all of the Muslim religion, as we've seen with the controversies around religious symbols in public spaces and now within society.
Dans l'espace public et maintenant d'ailleurs dans l'espace social simplement.
For years, the veil worn by Muslim women has been the subject of controversy, a touchstone for the tensions surrounding the question of secularism. In 2004, a law was passed prohibiting the wearing of conspicuous religious symbols at school, such as the veil. In 2010, the full veil, the burqa, was banned in public with the adoption of a law prohibiting the concealment of the face. More recently, in 2021, the so-called law against separatism was adopted to fight against radical Islam. It gave the state the power to control religious associations if they're suspected of not respecting Republican values. But then what place does religion really occupy among the French? Philippe Portier, who wrote a book called Religion in Contemporary France, sees a combination of polarization and secularization.
Fewer and fewer French people today claim to be a member of a religion. I can give you a figure. In the 1950s, 95% of the population said they were Catholic. Today, it's simply 32%.
On the other hand, you also have the emergence of religious zealots, to be found on the fringes of society.
Par exemple, du côté du judaïsme.
For example, with Judaism, you get the ultra-Orthodox movement, and with Protestants, it's the evangelical communities.
Avec les communautés évangéliques. Du côté des catholiques.
We've seen the rise of identity Catholics.
Mouvement de catholiques d'identité. Et puis enfin, les populations musulmanes avec.
And then the Muslim populations with a fixation on zealotry among the young, who go more to the mosque, they pray more, and they're more attached to the halal dimension and to the dimension of the purity of life. These people tend to be mainly recruited from the most marginalized segments of society.
Ces populations se recrutent essentiellement dans les segments les plus en marge de la société.
Et du coup, je vais vous poser
Is it difficult to be a Muslim in France?
D'être musulman en France.
C'est difficile pour les autres.
It's difficult for others that people are Muslim.
Que les gens soient musulmans.
Being a Muslim is super easy. It means having your personal convictions and combining them with the values of the Republic. I don't feel torn at all. Not with France, not with Sciences Po, not with anything.
Ni avec Sciences Po, ni avec quoi que ce soit.
You've been listening to the 4th episode of Crossroads France, a podcast from Agence France Presse, which is also available in French under the title Turbulence. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to share it and tell everyone you know about it. In our final podcast, we're going to be heading away from the mountains and towards the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and the world of farming, which is facing up to the problems and opportunities raised by global warming. Islam, the high-risk debate, was originally created by Antoine Boyer. My name is Barney Spender. À la prochaine.